If you have been wounded by someone who refuses to take responsibility, if you have spent months or even years waiting for an apology that never arrived, then you are standing at the edge of one of life's most painful and quiet psychological battles. This is the conflict between protecting your self-respect and craving validation from someone who may never give it. The pain deepens when the person who hurt you does not feel remorse in the way most people expect. A narcissist does not apologize because they fully recognize the harm they caused. They apologize only when the stability of their carefully protected inner world is threatened, when their control or public image is at risk. Today, you are going to understand exactly why this happens and what you must do if you ever want to hear the words you were denied. This is not about manipulation. It is about reclaiming your power, restoring your dignity, and learning the specific behaviors that force accountability in a personality built to avoid it. What you are about to learn works not because it is harsh, but because it is grounded in truth, a truth many people are too polite or too hopeful to face. Many people want to believe that apologies come from sudden bursts of empathy. They imagine that one day the person who hurt them wakes up, feels the weight of their actions, and comes forward humbled and sincere. That belief is emotionally comforting. It softens the pain of rejection and abandonment, but it is psychologically naive. In reality, most real apologies, especially from people with narcissistic traits, do not come from compassion or self-reflection. They come from consequence, from external pressure that makes staying the same more painful than changing. Human beings, even those with deeply rooted narcissistic patterns, change not because they suddenly feel your pain, but because the cost of remaining unchanged becomes too high. The trigger is not moral clarity alone. It is the friction that occurs when their fantasy self-image collides with reality. A narcissistic personality is designed to avoid shame at all costs, to protect a grand image of the self, and to control how they are seen by others. Compassion rarely breaks through this structure, but consequence can. When the outside world begins to challenge the internal fantasy that protects them, pressure builds. Under that pressure, behavior sometimes shifts. For a narcissist, apologizing is never a purely moral act. It is strategic, calculated, and reactive. Their psychology is not guided by an inner conscience, but by an ongoing cycle of reward and threat. When you continue to tolerate mistreatment, remain emotionally available after being hurt, or explain their behavior hoping they will finally understand, you remove consequence. You create a reality where their actions cost them nothing. In that environment, an apology serves no purpose. There is no reason for self-examination because their behavior is repeatedly confirmed as survivable and often profitable. When you keep giving attention, emotional labor, and access without accountability, the narcissist keeps everything without paying a price. There is no friction, no cost, and no motivation to reflect. Consequence introduces discomfort and destabilizes their internal system. It disrupts the belief that they can act freely without repercussion. When access is removed, admiration is withdrawn, and control is challenged, the narcissist experiences something far more threatening than guilt: the collapse of supply. What they feel is not true remorse for your pain, but anxiety about their own instability. Their identity is regulated from the outside. When that regulation disappears, distress follows. That distress becomes the space where an apology can emerge, not because they feel you're suffering, but because they are forced to confront their own fragility and loss of control. This is why begging for an apology almost never works. When you plead for empathy, explain yourself, or defend your experience, you signal dependence. You show that your emotional balance still depends on their response. That is not an invitation to compassion. It is proof that their leverage remains. But when you withdraw, when you stop explaining, defending, hoping, or chasing closure, you introduce uncertainty. You create cost without saying a word. Silence becomes the message. Access now has conditions, and the condition is respect. The apology that follows consequence is different from one forced by pleading. It is not born from understanding your pain, but from experiencing their own loss. This truth can feel uncomfortable because it challenges our moral instincts. We want to believe that people act ethically because they suddenly see the harm they caused. But in reality, behavior is often shaped more by structure than insight. Even emotionally healthy people rely on boundaries and consequences to guide behavior. For individuals with narcissistic tendencies, this reliance is almost complete. Without consequence, the moral compass stays inactive and apologies are delayed indefinitely. When an apology finally arrives, it often feels late and hollow. It usually comes after you have already detached, after you rebuilt yourself without their validation, after you reclaimed your dignity. The words may sound correct, even polished, but empty. Still, psychologically, their appearance confirms something important. Your self-respect shifted the power dynamic. The change did not come from convincing them of your worth, but from making their behavior costly. Consequence became the agent of change, and your growth came from enforcing it. Consequence also changes you. By allowing natural outcomes to unfold, you step out of the role of the one who waits and hopes and into the role of someone who authors their own life. This can be frightening at first because it means accepting that the apology may never come. You are then faced with a deeper choice. Do you want justice through words or freedom through boundaries? When you choose consequence over compassion as your guiding principle, you stop organizing your life around another person's limitations. That choice builds resilience and self-trust. The paradox is that the moment you no longer need the apology for emotional stability is often the moment it becomes possible. Not because they transformed into an empathetic person, but because the structure of the relationship changed. Behavior responds to context more reliably than character. This is not cynicism. It is an honest observation of human motivation, especially in personalities built around control and image rather than mutual accountability. Silence is one of the most misunderstood forces in relationships. It is often mistaken for weakness or avoidance. In reality, silence is an active psychological strategy, a withdrawal of energy from a system that survives on reaction. In narcissistic dynamics, engagement of any kind is fuel. Arguments, explanations, emotions, and defenses all validate their sense of importance. Control is maintained through predictable interaction. As long as you react, the cycle continues. Silence breaks the cycle not by fighting, but by removing the supply that feeds it. A narcissistic personality depends on external engagement to regulate their inner world. Even negative attention proves they still matter. When you argue, you confirm their relevance. When you defend yourself, you accept their authority to judge. When you seek understanding, you give them power over your reality. Silence removes all of this. It creates a void that cannot be twisted or controlled. At first, silence often triggers escalation. They may provoke, accuse, or attempt to induce guilt. This is a predictable reaction to lost control. Each ignored attempt weakens the pattern they relied on. Silence also frees your nervous system. When you stop reacting, you interrupt the stress reward loop that kept you attached. At first, anxiety or guilt may surface. That urge to respond is not love, it is conditioning. Over time, your inner world separates from their behavior. You stop managing damage and anticipating conflict. This inner calm is liberating for you and deeply threatening to the narcissistic dynamic. When your reactions disappear, their sense of power erodes. Your silence forces them to react to you instead of controlling you. What once felt like your dependence becomes their uncertainty. Detachment reveals the imbalance in the relationship. When you speak, you feed the old structure. When you remain silent, the flow becomes one-sided. They may attempt partial apologies or manufactured crises to restore engagement. These are not reflections. They are attempts to regain access. Each time you resist, you reinforce a new structure where access has limits and consequences. Silence is not punishment, it is self-preservation. You are not withdrawing to harm them. You are withdrawing to protect yourself. Narcissistic dynamics thrive on overexposure. Silence closes that channel. You become less readable and less controllable. Over time, this absence reshapes the power dynamic without argument or explanation. Boundaries are not rules for others, they are conditions for your participation. Narcissistic personalities ignore moral appeals but respond to consistent consequences. Silence paired with boundaries creates a structure they cannot override, restoring your autonomy without force or negotiation. Through this deliberate withdrawal, you begin to reclaim your autonomy, protect your sense of self, and slowly rebalance a relationship that once demanded constant emotional effort from you. Accountability does not come from explaining yourself again and again. It comes from structure. In a narcissistic dynamic, the absence of firm and enforceable boundaries quietly becomes the foundation that allows the other person unlimited freedom. Each time you tolerate disrespect, justify poor treatment, or stay present after being emotionally hurt, you are unintentionally teaching them where the real limits are. Not the limits you talk about, but the limits you actually enforce through your behavior. Over time, verbal protests lose their meaning because your actions remain the same. The narcissistic individual learns a simple psychological rule. Your pain does not interfere with their access to you. Once this rule is learned, accountability fades because there is no real consequence attached to crossing your boundaries. Boundaries introduce consequence. They turn abstract ideas like respect and dignity into visible outcomes that alter the structure of the relationship. When a boundary is activated, something in the external environment changes. Access is reduced. Privileges are removed. Emotional availability becomes limited. Participation in your life is restricted. This matters because narcissistic personalities are guided far more by external conditions than by internal values or moral reasoning. They are highly sensitive to where attention, validation, and emotional supply flow and where they stop. The moment your boundary interrupts that flow, their behavior enters unfamiliar territory, a psychological space where old strategies no longer work. At first, boundaries are often met with pushback. They may respond with mockery, dismissal, or attempts to minimize your concerns. You may be accused of being dramatic, selfish, unreasonable, or cruel. They may try to frame your limits as attacks or betrayals. This reaction is not confusion, it is a test. They are searching for inconsistency, looking for the moment when your resolve weakens and the old dynamic returns. Every boundary that collapses under pressure teaches them that persistence is enough to override your limits. Every boundary that holds teaches them something they cannot ignore. The reality has changed. What makes boundaries so threatening is that they shift power away from emotional persuasion and into personal choice. You are no longer trying to convince someone that you deserve respect. You behave as though respect is required for access to your life. This quiet firmness dismantles the illusion that sustains the dynamic, the belief that they control both the terms of interaction and the definition of what is acceptable. A boundary communicates without argument that the rules are different now. In this context, accountability is not a moral awakening. It is a behavioral adjustment. When boundaries are consistently enforced, the narcissistic individual begins to experience a gap between what they expect and what actually happens. Behaviors that once guaranteed attention now create distance. Actions that once provoked engagement now result in silence. This mismatch creates psychological discomfort, not because they suddenly feel empathy for your pain, but because their predictions no longer match the outcome. This discomfort becomes the mechanism through which accountability begins to appear. From your perspective, setting boundaries often feels destabilizing. It requires you to tolerate their discomfort without rushing to soothe it. Many people who grew up in emotionally unpredictable or unsafe environments learned early that their role was to maintain peace at any cost. Boundaries directly challenge this conditioning. Holding a boundary forces you to sit with grief and disappointment. When the other person responds with anger, withdrawal, or contempt instead of reflection, you are confronted with the reality of who they are rather than the version you hoped they would become. Accountability requires facing this truth. No amount of explaining, waiting, or self-sacrifice will change the structure. Your real power lies in your own participation, your responses, and the limits you enforce. For a narcissistic individual, losing unrestricted access feels like a deep injury. They experience boundaries not as neutral rules, but as rejection. This perception increases their attempts to regain control, whether through charm, pressure, intimidation, or displays of remorse. The difference now is that consistent boundaries turn these behaviors into information. Over time, you learn to tell the difference between temporary compliance and real accountability. Verbal cooperation is fragile. It often disappears when pressure returns or when familiar patterns resurface. Real accountability requires consistent behavior over time and across situations. Narcissistic personalities often test boundaries repeatedly. They behave well for a short period, showing apparent understanding or regret, then slowly reintroduce old behaviors to see if your enforcement weakens. Each time a test succeeds, the old hierarchy is restored. Each time a boundary holds, the new structure becomes stronger. This cycle is intentional. It is designed to measure your consistency. Boundaries also change you internally. You stop seeing yourself as someone who reacts and adapts to another person's moods. You begin to see yourself as someone who shapes their own experience. Your identity reorganizes around what you allow rather than what you tolerate. This shift is subtle but powerful. You may notice that your emotional stability no longer depends on whether they improve or understand you. It depends on how consistently you honor your own limits. The chaos that once mirrored their volatility begins to quiet as your internal rules become clearer. Accountability in this dynamic may be partial or reluctant. It may be framed as concession rather than responsibility. Still, it reflects a fundamental change. Behavior adjusts because the environment requires it, not because of moral insight. Detachment is often misunderstood as coldness or lack of feeling. In reality, it is precise and strong. Detachment means withdrawing emotional dependence, not eliminating emotion. You may still feel sadness, anger, disappointment, or affection, but these feelings no longer control your actions. In narcissistic dynamics, control is built through emotional entanglement. The more reactive and dependent you are, the more influence they hold. Over time, your reactions become predictable, and predictability becomes a tool for manipulation. Every emotional reaction gives them a map to your inner world. Detachment disrupts this map. It makes your internal state less accessible. What makes detachment so unsettling for them is that it cannot be argued away. You can debate accusations and defend yourself against distortions, but emotional investment cannot be forced. Detachment creates a vacuum where dominance once existed. They may continue to criticize, assert authority, or perform concern, but these efforts lose impact when your nervous system no longer revolves around their approval. For you, detachment often begins with discomfort. You stop monitoring their moods, anticipating reactions, or adjusting yourself to avoid conflict. Anxiety may surface because your body learned that vigilance meant safety. Over time, as no disaster follows your withdrawal, your nervous system slowly adjusts. You learn that safety does not require constant emotional scanning. Detachment helps you see that what once felt like connection was often regulation. You were not simply relating, you were managing emotional instability. The energy was reactive, not mutual, control disguised as closeness. As detachment deepens, your stability anchors within you rather than in another person's reactions. Narcissistic individuals often rely on your emotional feedback to regulate their identity. When you detach, that function disappears. They may label this absence as abandonment or betrayal, but the deeper issue is the loss of emotional anchoring. Without your reactions, their instability can no longer be managed externally. True leverage does not come from making them understand. It comes from no longer needing them to. When you stop trying to control how they see you, your behavior becomes less predictable and harder to manipulate. You stop over-explaining, defending your character, or seeking agreement to validate reality. This withdrawal weakens one of the core tools of dominance, the ability to control the narrative. Detachment also reshapes your sense of worth. When your value is no longer measured by their attention, you are forced to find it within yourself. At first, this may feel empty because a familiar source of validation has been removed before a new internal foundation is formed. This emptiness is not failure. It is space. It is the ground where autonomy grows. From their perspective, detachment is infuriating because it resists control. Guilt loses power. Provocation stops working. Charm feels ineffective. Threats lose urgency. Each failed attempt to pull you back into emotional reaction confirms a truth they cannot escape. The structure has changed and it is no longer centered around them,